Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about a topic that many, including myself, have debated, pondered, and thrown out some opinions on, and that is the debate on what the worst plane of World War II was. This is something that I've talked about before, but the very idea of determining the single worst plane made is actually kind of complex. How exactly do you quantify performance across different classes and roles? Is it comparative with one another across class and role, or comparative to a sort of average performance in that class? How do you factor in when the plane was produced? How do you factor in production totals and usage in combat? And how do you factor in things that can't really be quantified, just like how a plane controls? There are actually a lot of angles and factors to consider, and a lot of the factors are largely just opinion-based, and how strongly one feels about one plane over another. Personally, if I had to pick one right now off the top of my head, I think I would say the MXY-7 Oka, the Japanese kamikaze rocket plane, considering that it wasn't all that effective, had hundreds of them made, destroyed itself upon use, and killed the pilot. I would certainly consider that a very bad plane. A factor that weighs very heavily to me is the total production run of the plane being considered. My reasoning is that the increased production of a bad plane not only increases its potential prevalence on the battlefield, but also increases the amount of time, money, and resources invested in the program. If I were considering a plane that was pretty poor and had a total production run of 1,000 plus against a plane that barely flew and, blew up, had only 2 made, I would consider the former as the worse overall plane. So with that in mind, today's subject is certainly in the running for worst plane of World War II, a plane that had a pretty significant production run and would be shipped across the globe to serve in several militaries, and would never actually serve or be accepted for combat use by anyone. This is a plane that the National Naval Aviation Museum regards quite simply as a classic failure, which is kinda like somebody saying, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed." This is the Brewster SB2A Buccaneer, also known as the Brewster Bermuda. All the way back in 1934, the U.S. Navy would issue specifications and begin a little contest for a new aircraft design, specifically a scout bomber. Generally speaking, scout aircraft are kind of forgotten about, serving an important but uncelebrated role. For a scout bomber, planes would have the dual role of scouting targets ahead, whether they be ships, enemy troops, artillery, or airfields, and attacking and picking off targets when possible. The pilot or co-pilot could radio in what they were seeing, or they would return to base and relay their findings, giving vital information for actual designated attack aircraft for the battle ahead. Ideally, for such a plane, the most important specification would be range. You want it to be able to fly over to enemy territory, fly around and gather info, and then fly back. So for this specification, Brewster Aeronautical Corporation would design the XSBA-1, a single-engine monoplane with an extended cockpit/canopy that would house 3 crew members, the pilot, the navigator, and a gunner. The gunner would be operating a single 30 caliber machine gun facing to the rear. It would also be able to carry upwards of 500 pounds of explosives located in an internal bomb bay. Powered by a single Wright R1820 Cyclone radial engine with just under 800 horsepower, it would manage a top speed upwards of 254 miles an hour, which, considering its first flight date of April 15, 1936, is pretty impressive, and that top speed at that time gave it the distinction of most likely being the fastest single-engine bomber in the world. With a range upwards of 1,000 miles, the XSBA was incredibly promising and looked to be on its way to being a prominent scout bomber for the late 30s and early 40s. But because Brewster wasn't the biggest company, nor was it particularly well run, allegedly, it became clear to the US Navy that even though the XSBA was promising, and that they did in fact want it, Brewster would not be able to produce it in a timely manner. Additionally, Brewster was working on another aircraft for the Navy in the Brewster F2A Buffalo, which would mean a further diversion of resources. This led to the US Navy itself producing the XSBA, under the new designation SBN under license at the Naval Aircraft Factory. However, their production of the SBN was also slow, and by the time of their first completed plane in November 1940, the once promising performance had become outdated, and the 30 or so SBNs that they made were largely just used for training. But over with Brewster with the SBN off their plate, this gave them the time and resources to work more on the Buffalo, and foolishly the gumption to work on new designs to be submitted to the US military. Now, if they couldn't handle both the SBN and the Buffalo, then why exactly did they think they would be able to handle the Buffalo and a new design? I guess they really were poorly run. Regardless, in response to yet another call from the US Navy for a new scout bomber design in 1939, Brewster would dust off the old SBN design, and they would rework it to make it bigger, faster, and more powerful. At minimum, the Navy wanted a new scout bomber with a 1,000-mile range and a 1,000-pound bomb payload, and since the SBN already had a range of about 1,000 miles, the clear path forward seemed to just be making a bigger version of that. Brewster would present their Model 340 design, which, looking at it and the SBN side by side, they almost appear to be the same plane. Measuring in at 11.58 meters long, 14.33 meters wide, and 4.7 meters tall, the Model 340 was about 3 meters longer, 2.5 meters wider, and 2 meters taller, basically just a scaled-up SBN. Powered by a single Wright R2600 radial engine with 1,700 horsepower, the Model 340 would ideally be able to carry upwards of 1,500 pounds of explosives, 1,000 pounds in an internal bomb bay, and 500 externally on the wings. The 340 would also be much more well-armed, with an array of 30 cal and 50 cal machine guns. 6 guns would be forward-firing, 2 in the nose, 4 in the wings, and there would also be a remote-operated twin turret facing to the rear. The Navy was interested in this design and would order a single prototype, designated the XSB2A, in April 1939, and production was slow. During the initial prototype production, orders from not only the United States government but foreign countries as well would start coming in. France would have a letter of intent to purchase the plane in June 1940, and following their fall shortly after, Britain would pick up that letter and place an order for upwards of 750 planes in November 1940. Australia, too, would place an order for over 200 planes in 1940. America would place an order for 140 in December 1940, and finally, even the Dutch would place an order for 162 in mid-1941. The XSB2A was clearly a hot commodity, but not actually as a scout bomber, but as a dive bomber, as the wings were to be equipped with dive brakes and serve, if needed, as a dive bomber. The early success of the German Stuka made a lot of countries panic and scramble for a new dive bomber of their very own. And as Brewster would be scrambling to meet the design needs of not only the United States, but of the foreign countries as well, this would lead to even further delays, and the first prototype only ended up flying on June 17, 1941, over 2 years after the prototype was ordered. The results of the flight were slightly promising but very concerning. Weighing 7,208 pounds empty, Without the full rear gun turret installed and just a Mach 1 in its place, the top speed was upwards of 313 miles an hour at 18,000 feet. So it would ideally have a decent top speed. That was the one somewhat promising aspect. As for the rest of the plane, there were a lot of problems. The ailerons were improperly designed. The plane did not control well in any regard. There were excessive buffeting issues with the dive brakes. Buffeting being turbulent airflow over the surface that can cause excessive vibration and overall loss of control. These buffeting issues would extend to the entirety of the tail section, in large part because of the turret section, and there would be an overall loss in rudder effectiveness. So basically, the initial prototype was an aerodynamic disaster. To fix some of the tail issues, the tail surfaces would be enlarged, and that did indeed help reduce the issues, but not fix them. But there was another problem with the turret. Because they were using a mock turret that didn't actually weigh that much, they discovered that when they would install the real one, it would add up to 600 pounds of weight to the rear and throw off the center of gravity. This then necessitated a lengthening of the fuselage up to 11.94 meters. Even with all of these horrid aerodynamic problems, in early 1942, the design was actually accepted by the Navy and given the official designation of SB2A1. However, as the installation of the turret, the tail enlargement, and other improvements led to substantial weight increases, the top speed began to decrease. Eventually, because of the weight and overall aerodynamic issues that the turret system would bring, they could mitigate it but not fix it. The Navy decided to just remove the turret in July 1942 and replace it with just a guy with a twin gun. Around the same time, Britain actually began receiving their first SB2A planes, which they called the Bermuda Mark I. The foreign sales of this design were actually much easier to complete, as their specifications had long since abandoned the defensive turret that had been causing problems for the US design, and theirs called for a rear gunner like the US eventually settled on. With the removal of that turret, likely improving control for British models, along with a reduction in the bomb load down to 500 pounds internally and 500 externally, that would decrease the weight and hopefully improve performance, the British found their Bermudas to be unsuitable for combat. Despite placing an order for 750 of them, Britain only received 468 before they decided that enough was enough and they cancelled the rest. Britain would only ever use them for training purposes, and honestly I like that idea. Train the pilot on the bad plane so he's even better with the good plane. The models that they didn't use for training were either used as target tugs or just sat rotting in storage. Some of them were given to Canada, but they suffered a similar fate here as well. All the while, in the background at Brewster, the company, while the Buccaneer was going through its initial flight testing and early plethora of issues that needed to be fixed, Brewster as a company was going through some turmoil. Numerous men at the top, including Brewster President James Work, had been convicted of or accused of financial crimes like fraud, and the overall quality of product coming from Brewster was poor. This led to the Navy taking de facto control temporarily sometime around mid to late 1941 by installing their own company president named George Chapline. However, Work would manage to regain the job in 1942 and was then promptly sued for $10 million for, among other things, fraud. This, in part, led to the Navy just completely taking over control of the company in April 1942, hoping to salvage whatever was there and hopefully continue and accelerate production and right the ship, as it were. Still, though, even under Navy control, production issues at Brewster persisted, and in an effort to accelerate production and delivery of the Buccaneer, the first planes delivered to the Navy would not actually be able to serve on carriers. The first 80 models of the Buccaneer, delivered in 1943, were a slightly different land-based variant called the SB2A2. These only really differed in their armament being slightly reduced. From 6 forward-firing guns, they would go down to 4, 2 50 cal machine guns in the nose, and 2 30 cal in the wings, along with that twin 30 cal rear gun. This didn't really alter performance in any significant way, and I'm not entirely sure why they did this. Maybe they just wanted to try to save some resources or cut a little weight, which they really needed to do. The SB2A2 and subsequent models were quite heavy, weighing 9,924 pounds empty and 12,239 pounds gross. Basically a 33% increase in weight from the initial prototype. This weight increase corresponded with a decrease in top speed, down to 274 miles an hour at 12,000 feet. It did have at least one thing going for it, though, and that was, as a pure scout with no bomb load whatsoever, its range was 1,675 miles. With the bomb load, though, that range would actually drop by 1,000 miles, which wasn't good. A year later, in 1944, the Navy would receive the next batch of Buccaneers, another new variant that this time could actually serve on carriers in the SB2A3. The performance of these models wouldn't change from the previous variant, but they would have folding wings and an arresting hook under the tail. The Navy would receive 60 of these, and they would never serve on carriers. When the Navy received them in 1944, the SB2A3 had already failed carrier tests that took place in late 1943. Flying over land and landing on a mock carrier runway, they were found to be insufficient for use on carriers, and still the Navy received them regardless. Additionally, as well, the Navy would receive yet another batch in parallel to the other two, yet again a different variant, in the SB2A4. Truth be told, though, they weren't a new model improving upon the 3, and in fact, the 4 kind of came before the 3, going against things being linear. The 4 was simply the export model that was designed for European countries in 40-41, with America joining the war directly in late 1941 after Pearl Harbor, and with Brewster making these planes domestically, they decided that the 162 planes that were earmarked for the Dutch would instead be going to the Navy for testing. These models were slightly different than the 2 and 3, in that they went back to having 6 forward-firing guns. All were 30 cal, 2 in the nose, 4 in the wings, and the twin rear-firing 30 cal. Additionally, the 4 was actually without some equipment internally that would normally be on American planes, so that actually reduced the weight a little bit and very slightly improved performance. Even still, with the first few being delivered to the Navy in early 1943, the results were much like other models, poor. As the U.S. military continued to receive the 2, 3, and 4 models up into 1944, it was clear to them that the Buccaneer would never be a viable aircraft. It just didn't control well, it was too heavy, construction quality was poor, and even after being taken over by the Navy, the Brewster factories just plain sucked. The Navy didn't even try to use the planes as flight trainers due to how poorly they performed, and instead a good number of them were used for mechanic training or as target tugs, much like the British did. A good number as well were thrown into some gun ranges for soldier target practice, and even more still were delivered from Brewster and immediately placed into storage or just flat out scrapped. A very small handful would have a second chance with the Marines as a potential night fighter and night fighter trainer. They were poor in this role as well, and quickly faded from use with the Marines. So with how bad the Buccaneer was being received behind the scenes, I want to very quickly talk about a book that was published in 1943 called America's Fighting Planes in Action by Reed Kynert. I would assume, due to the wording in the book, that Kynert was basing his writings and opinions on whatever was released publicly about these planes, and because of that, the specifications of some of these planes are incorrect. He includes a section on the Buccaneer, and it's pretty comical to read it in hindsight. I'll link it in the description, but the second sentence of this section reads, "Already the Buck is being regularly delivered in quantity to the Navy for important missions as a scout bomber." He also lists it as having a top speed of 350 miles an hour, a bomb load of about 2,000 pounds, at least 4 50 caliber machine guns, and he ends it by saying it meets all the requirements with some to spare. As we now know, all of this is wrong, and it's comical how enthusiastic he seemed to be about the Buccaneer. Of course, he almost certainly didn't have the real picture, and was basing things off of basically US propaganda. But his book and this section are pretty fascinating as a result. And finally, let's take one last look at Brewster as a company. Where did they go after the colossal flop that was the Buccaneer? Well, somehow, in the midst of that debacle, in 1943, Brewster would end up being contracted to produce F4U Corsairs under license, their models being called the F3A1 Corsair. Now, why exactly the black sheep of aircraft manufacturing was given such a role is beyond me, but I do assume with the Navy being in control in 1943, and Brewster really just making the Buccaneer very slowly, the Navy figured they could get something out of them with a design that was already proven to be good. Brewster just had to follow directions and make the Corsair, simple enough. Well, Brewster couldn't even get that right. And while they would manage to produce 735 Corsairs, they were of remarkably poor quality, and several would lose their wings mid-flight. Because of this, the Brewster Corsairs were relegated to less intensive roles away from the front line. On July 1st, 1944, with the Brewster Corsairs proving to be poor, the production contract was cancelled. As they were now, they were not producing anything, and it was clear to everybody from the military to Congress that Brewster was a poorly run company. Brewster was shut down later in 1944 and officially dissolved on April 5, 1946. From its inception in 1932 to its end in 1946, the sad reality is that their best creation, their most successful design, was none other than the F2A Buffalo, a plane with such a poor reputation today, frequently appearing on worst planes of World War II lists. The Buffalo might have been their best plane. At the very least, it served in combat, and served well with some foreign countries in small numbers. But more than the Buffalo, I do think that the Buccaneer perfectly represents Brewster as a company. A horrid, faulty mess of a design that was all promise and no delivery. Well, I mean, I guess they did deliver them, but nobody wanted them, so all promise and delivery, but no use. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. That book I mentioned earlier also mentions the Buffalo, but skirts around the fact that it didn't serve all that well with America. It proudly mentions that it served in Midway, but neglects to tell you that 13 of the 20 used were lost. If nothing else, the book is an interesting look into the difference between how US propaganda presented these planes versus the reality of them. A pretty big background part of war is keeping your people happy, content, and confident in your country, confident that their weapons are great and out there dominating, defeating the enemy. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.